If you're like me, you've probably played with every weapon in Battlefield 1 by now. If you've played the game extensively since launch, it's very likely that you would have tried out each weapon at least for a few minutes, hell, maybe even a few hours. The only exception really to the rule for me in that is the Martini Henry, and that's just because I'm too lazy to get to level 10 Scout, but I promise I will somehow manage to do that at some point, or just get one of those cheeky shortcut bundles and get my way through it. But with the exception of the level 10 weapons, you've probably realized by now that Battlefield 1 has a bit of a diversity issue, and this is something that we've seen in lots of Battlefields as well. Now, if I pick up any random LMG in Battlefield 1 and then move over to a slightly different LMG, so let's say I go from using a low-weight Lewis gun to using a low-weight MG15, ultimately I'm not really going to notice a significant difference. There is a magazine difference, of course, the guns do have different stats, but playing with the two works out ultimately the same. I don't change my strategy, I don't really change my tactics, and the weapons just do feel very similar. The same applies to some of the medic weapons, and the same applies to assault weapons and even some sniper rifles as well. I'm sure many of you have found instances where you're using a gun such as the M1916 Cell Blaster, and then you switch over to the Mondragon Storm, and although they have different mag counts and feel slightly different in terms of how they handle, by the time you've played with it for long enough, they just feel like they operate in a very similar manner, to the extent where it feels samey, it feels boring, and it just feels like you may as well choose the gun that has the superior statistics. Now, the reason this poses such a threat to Battlefield 1 is that it could very well end up walking the dark path of Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4. Its predecessors always had a problem whereby once the DLC cycle was completed and once all the weapons were finally in the game, ultimately all of them were very similar. There were so many assault rifles that were basically the same thing, so many carbines and SMGs that played in the same way and operated in the same dynamics that realistically what most people went for was just the most powerful one they could see, not something that necessarily suited their playstyle. A good example of this was in Battlefield 3, where the M16A3 effectively became the assault rifle that everybody used because on paper it was statistically the most powerful. There were other assault rifles available in the game, but because they operated so similarly to the M16A3, it made sense simply to choose what was best on paper, and that's exactly what happened. A similar situation also occurred in Battlefield 4. Most players wanted to try different playstyles and try different weapons that were available, but there were just too many similar weapons to make that distinction. For me personally, I had this problem when I started using the M416 in Battlefield 4. This assault rifle was so generic, so versatile, and so good at near enough everything it did, there was more or less no reason to try any other assault rifle in game. I could use the AEK 971 and probably win a few more close quarters engagements, but it wasn't significant enough a trade-off for me to give up the M416. And now we move on to Battlefield 1, where a similar situation is starting to unfold. Despite only having one expansion pack, a lot of the weapons do simply just feel the same, or most people default to choosing the weapon that is best on paper. A good example of this for me is using the Ruby Rolls, because it's the most versatile assault rifle in my opinion within the assault class, and another great example of this is the LMGs. You can choose any of the low weight variants of the LMGs and they will all play and operate in very similar manners without you having to change significantly how you play or what you do, and in that situation I just tend to go with whatever has the best statistics on paper. So what exactly is Battlefield 1 doing about this? Well, a DICE dev jumped into Reddit the other day by the name of DICE Random Deviation and said that he had noticed that weapons are starting to feel very similar in Battlefield 1. A previous Reddit user had commented that, "I noticed that when you have too many weapons like in Battlefield 4, that some can feel like clones of each other." The developer acknowledged this and said that he'd noticed this with some of the lower fire rate LMGs in Battlefield 1 where the damage per second is really low and have very little recoil, like I just mentioned, and that he's actually working on a significant weapon rebalance right now to try and get more variation in current weapons, as well as offering space for new weapons to have their own boots to fill. This is a very positive direction for Battlefield to take, and bearing in mind we still have In the Name of the Tsar and 2 more DLCs to release, all with their own fully fledged weapons, things are going to get pretty messy if diversity doesn't become a central focus. But there is another focus as well that needs to be touched on. One problem I'm finding with Battlefield 1 at the moment is that we have this strange line between something being diverse and something not being very functional. Like I mentioned earlier, the reason I use the Ribby rolls is because it offers the most variety and the most ability to try things at different ranges and different counters and different enclosures, and it makes the most sense as a weapon to use because of that variety. But in Battlefield 1 we have this sort of issue where if something is too diverse, it's only useful for one thing. Like an Automatico, for example. Using that extreme close quarters will always guarantee you a win, but it's absolutely useless for everything else. And finding a gun that is offering both a decent amount of playability in all fronts, as well as one that has its own diverse role, is quite a difficult line to strike. And I feel as though the first place that should start making this distinction is somewhere in the support weapons. Lots of the LMGs, like the developer noted, are simply too similar, and I'd like to see some of them offering higher damage outputs, some of them offering higher recoil, and just being in general more difficult, more interesting, and more fun to play with. That's just my 2 cents on the matter for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you guys think about the weapon balances in the comment section below, and as always, I'll see you again in the next one.